My guest tonight is my honored guest is Rachel Vogelstein, who is the co-author of a terrific new book that comes out tomorrow called Awakening, #MeToo and the Global Fight for Women's Rights. I'm so excited and honored that we get to talk to you a day before the big launch of your fantastic book. Let me ask you, first of all, before we get into your fascinating background, why this book? Why write this book? And just for listeners, Rachel is with the Council on Foreign Relations. She was also a professor at Georgetown Law, a law graduate, but she teaches gender and foreign policy. And so why this book? Why now, Rachel?
Well, thank you so much, Kim, for having me on to talk about this book and this movement. You know, most people know about the Me Too movement that swept across the United States in 2017. Awakening tells you the story that you don't yet know about the remarkable global impact of the Me Too movement, which has spread to over 100 countries around the world. And what started as an online campaign against sexual harassment has turned into the most widespread cultural reckoning on women's rights in history. So my co-author, Megan Stone, and I knew this was a story that had to be told.
So if we could break that down a little for viewers who don't necessarily follow this as closely as you and I might, when you say what began as an online campaign against sexual harassment, what are you referring to? Are you referring to #MeToo? What is it? How would you define that movement itself?
You know, the Me Too movement that we know of that started in October of 2017 was actually popularizing a hashtag that was first coined in 2006 by civil rights activist Tarana Burke, who I'm honored wrote the foreword for our book. And what was fascinating to see is that hashtag go viral because of access to 21st century technology that is now permeated around the world. This hashtag has been translated into dozens of languages. In some countries, there were digital movements that predated the global spread of the Me Too hashtag. But what was fascinating was to see how technology was being used to share a universality of experiences in terms of harassment and discrimination that really helped women find their collective voice and their collective power.
So the thing I love the most about this book is the optimism and the sort of making clear and naming the amount of progress that's being made internationally around the rights of women. Because in this country, some people, before you came on air, I was talking about the Bill Cosby decision. Of course, we just had 4 years of Donald Trump and many allegations of sexual misconduct, even criminal activity by Mr. Trump against dozens of women. And many people look at this and say, listen, we're moving in the wrong direction. Before we get to the international piece, which is obviously the focus of your book, how do you answer people who say that, listen, we're going in the wrong direction? You know, women's rights are being sort of trampled on before our very eyes, not the other way around.
You know, I think that both in this country and in many of the nations we travel to around the world, what we saw is that women's voices are being heard in ways that we haven't seen in history. You know, if you take a case like Bill Cosby, what happened in that case was really because of a procedural technicality. It wasn't because the more than 60 women who came forward weren't believed. And in fact, the fact that those 60 women felt emboldened to come forward in the first instance shows you that we are in a different moment where women are willing to step forward courageously to share their stories, where women are demanding change and demanding justice, and where we are starting to see in some places laws and policies change. And I'll give 2 examples right here in the United States. You know, we have seen in recent weeks the issue of military sexual assault addressed by the Biden administration, and importantly, a bipartisan group of officials in the Senate coming together to support reforms that have been talked about for a decade. You know, the bill that is pending in Congress right now that has so much support has been championed by Senator Gillibrand for 10 years. The language itself isn't that different. What's different is that we are hearing women's voices in new ways. Another example, the Department of Education has recently said that it will review rules related to reporting campus sexual assault. In the prior administration, the rules were changed to make it more difficult for students to come forward and to demand freedom from discrimination when they're seeking education. There's already signs that those rules will be revised and strengthened so that women on campuses across the country can enjoy the same right to education that men do.
So how much, Rachel, is that because we have Joe Biden as president versus something that's taken hold in our social consciousness? And it's hard, given your amazing background and the fact that you worked in the State Department under then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that you were an advisor on women's issues during her 2016 campaign for the presidency. And you mention in your book, in the intro, this label that was attached to her, the quote, unlikable label. And some people thought, listen, the fact that she was a woman who was, some say, the most qualified person to run for the presidency in the history of the United States, that was her failure. What's your sense of that, having been inside the campaign and close to Hillary Clinton as she sought the highest office in this country?
In the book, we outline an agenda to turn protest into progress. And it's one that applies right here to the United States in addition to countries around the world. This is an agenda that's informed by leaders on the front lines. And we've come to refer to it as the 5 R's: redress for survivors, reform of the law, representation for women, resources for implementation, and a recalibration of social norms. And it's that last piece that really gets at what you were just talking about, ensuring that we treat survivors with seriousness and that we start from a place where we're not questioning the veracity of the stories of women who come forward, but hearing out their claims and testing them. And the same thing is true when it comes to women assuming greater positions of power, which of course is a precondition to solving many of these problems. Too often these laws relating to sexual assault and harassment are made by men and not women, and they're made by people who aren't survivors. So ensuring that we're revisiting predispositions about women in power and recasting what in the past has been and oftentimes a knee-jerk reaction to consider a woman seeking power to be unlikable, and instead to value the women leaders that we see around the world. And there's good reason for that. Even think about the moment we're in now, recovering from a global pandemic. It's no accident that the countries led by women actually outperformed men when it came to controlling the virus. Women were more conservative in terms of protecting against loss of life. They shut down faster. And as a result, in those countries, economies are rebounding faster because the virus is in a greater degree of control. So we have a lot to learn and to celebrate when it comes to women's leadership. And that will help solve many of these challenges.
So how do we see that actually implemented, though? I mean, it's aspirational, and I agree with you completely, but how do you translate that aspiration into actual change? I mean, let me put it another way. Do you think we are going to have a woman president anytime soon in the United States, or do you agree with this idea that the likability factor is just going to make it increasingly or ongoing very, very difficult for women to ever be elected to the White House?
Look, we just elected, after 2.5 centuries, Kamala Harris as vice president, now the highest ranking woman in history, the first woman to hold that role, the first Black and South Asian woman to be in that position. That's incredible progress. And if we think about the grand sweep of history, we are seeing women rising in terms of their numbers. Think even of the elections that took place in 2018 and then in 2020. We had a record number of women throwing their hat into the ring and willing to put everything on the line to ensure that they're part of the discussion, the debate, and the solution. And that is something we are seeing all around the world with this wave of women's activism rising, not only here in the US, but globally. We've seen a record number of women running for office and winning. And that's something that we write about even in a country like Brazil, where women have turned campaigns against sexual harassment into campaigns for political power. And in many places, they're winning.
Well, that's really interesting. I was really struck again in your book by sort of a little bit of your look back, where you write, quote, despite the reality that women are paid less than men everywhere in the world, remain dramatically underrepresented in capitals and boardrooms, comprise the majority of the world's poor, and face an epidemic of violence that affects 1 in 3 women in their lifetimes. When I shared that I was a women's rights lawyer in a room full of newly minted attorneys after my admission to the bar, the leader in charge of our training was incredulous. Quote, full-time, he asked, as if there wouldn't be enough work to keep me busy all day. Haven't women already achieved equality? How much of it is awareness that this is still a problem? Because we've seen this with Black Lives Matter, right? A lot of people think, oh, that, you know, racism is a thing of the past. Slavery ended a long time ago. How much of that is a problem or needs addressing from your perspective for the question of women's equality?
Look, we chose the title of our book very intentionally. This has been an awakening. It's been an awakening for women who are coming into the collective power of their voices. It's been awakening for men and for people across society who did think in many places that we had already addressed these issues. But in fact, you know, given the statistics that you've just outlined, it is clear that discrimination and harassment against women is pervasive and a challenge all around the world. And let me tell you why that matters. It matters not just to individual women who are harmed, though of course this is a human rights violation, but it also matters to our economies, to our security. You know, there's plenty of evidence showing that when women participate fully in the economy, poverty goes down and GDP goes up. We stand to gain between 12 and 24 trillion dollars in the global economy if we simply close the gaps between men and women in the labor force. This is one of those enormous gaps, discrimination and harassment that women face in the workplace. And we all stand to gain by doing something about it.
Yeah, you know, I have 4 daughters, and one of them took a college class recently, and I'm single, so they know how I work hard. They see what mom does. She took a college class recently, and she said, Mom, I didn't realize how much unpaid labor, how much our economy is held up by women working unpaid at home, keeping households going and raising children. You're nodding. She just said, listen, how is it that I don't appreciate what's done in that regard? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking just about equal pay, which astonishingly, we're still not even there in that regard?
You know, I'm talking about all of it. You know, just as in the civil rights era, the Birmingham bus boycott was not just about riding buses. It was about campaigning against an entire system of inequality. So too, the #MeToo movement has translated into broader campaigns for women's rights, addressing pay gaps, addressing the disproportionate burden of unpaid labor that women shoulder. And of course, this pandemic that we've just lived through and that we're living through really exposed many of those structural inequalities that we need to remedy if we're going to ensure that women fully participate in the workforce and across society.
So your book identifies 7 countries, and to talk about how the Me Too movement is swept to other parts of the world and so rapidly. It seems like that's the takeaway. The idea is, listen, folks, this really has made concrete change in a very short period of time. And your book underlines that as something to address and pay attention to. This is not just a hashtag. This has had an impact. So you choose, on the one hand, China, Pakistan, Tunisia, and on the other hand, a country like Sweden. And, you know, I looked at Sweden that chapter, said to myself, listen, I thought the Swedes had this all figured out. How did you choose these countries to focus on in terms of what's happening with women's rights in the wake of the Me Too movement?
You know, the truth is, Kim, we could have written this entire book with 7 different countries. This is a movement that is in over 100 countries around the world and has been searched online in all 193. So it really has had incredible global reach. But we sought to choose a group of countries that provided diversity in terms of geography and different parts of the world, diversity in terms of system of governments, from communist autocracies like China to small social democracies like Sweden. And, you know, we thought it was particularly important to choose a country like Sweden. There's often a perception that women face these challenges only in certain parts of the world. We should know that's not true from our own experience here in the United States. But even in a country like Sweden, which tops every global ranking in terms of gender equality and is often thought to be a utopia for women. They have significant challenges there, and they've had an enormous Me Too movement. And in fact, one of the women we write about in our Sweden chapter, her name is Cissi Wallin. Her story, I think, perfectly exemplifies the remaining challenges that still exist, even in countries where there are strong laws on the books. Cissi was allegedly assaulted. She came forward to the police about what had happened to her. The police chose to do nothing with her complaint. And so after the Me Too movement goes global, she's inspired to post her story. When she does, 11 other women come forward with disturbingly similar accusations. Ultimately, what happens? The man she accuses goes on to sue her for defamation, and he wins. She's appealing that verdict today. But I think what that shows is too often in too many places, women lack access to justice. And if we want women to litigate these issues in a court of law rather than in the court of public opinion, we've got to make sure that they too experience due process.
Well, it sounds like a couple threads jumped out for me in that story. One is the fact that coming forward, the courage of coming forward, brings other people to come forward and name this experience, and that's Me Too. Thread number two seems to be that women aren't believed, that women are disproportionately perhaps ignored or treated as lying or making it up, or having some ulterior motive, or maybe shamed in some way. And then the third piece is the retaliation for coming forward. So what are you seeing, Rachel, in your research, in your work, about that retaliation piece in general? So, people are not going to come forward if they feel like it's going to hurt their families and their futures. Has that changed, do you think, because of Me Too?
That's exactly right. The problem that you're highlighting is really, it explains why the Me Too movement has been so transformational. For centuries, people accused of sexual abuse, especially those with the most power, have had the legal system really tipped in their favor, while the reputations and integrity of survivors have been put on trial. So this injustice explains why, prior to the online Me Too movement, which could offer both anonymity and strength in numbers, so few women were willing to come forward to name what was plainly happening all around us. And delivering justice for survivors requires legal reform. We outline in the book some ideas for how to go about that. But even in just 3 years, we are starting to see transformative legal verdicts in diverse countries, from South Korea to Egypt to Sweden, where women are winning their cases for the first time. And that suggests that the rise in women's voices, that this collective power that women have chosen to exert, that has made a real difference, even in how we interpret existing laws on the books.
What's happening with the counterpoint? I have friends who have sons, and they're very worried about false allegations or lodged against boys about sort of social norms that really we've tolerated, that maybe aren't something we want to continue, but that maybe in that transition, when a man or a young man might kind of cross a boundary by mistake and get in big trouble. I mean, what are you seeing happening on that end? How do we reconcile those two things? Because in my own experience, I think there's some pushback on this idea of women's equality. Listen, this is going to hurt boys and men.
We've heard that while traveling around the world as well, not just here in the US. And, due process is critical. It's the cornerstone of any reputable justice system. Due process for the accused has to be part of the solution going forward. But if we want women to be able to use a court of law as opposed to other means, including posting online and trying to find community and support with one another, we need to make sure that access to justice is real. And that means changing some of the laws that we have now. It means strengthening the policies that exist to ensure that women are treated seriously. And it means changing social norms. The veracity of women is often questioned when they come forward. In our experience interviewing women on the front lines, women put a tremendous amount at risk when they come forward. The percentage of accusations that are false is incredibly low. So I think if we think about policy reform, but also questioning some of the social norms that cause us to question women who come forward, that will go a long ways towards addressing the propensity for women to look outside of the judicial system to get relief.
So on the one hand, when you talk about due process, we're both law professors and lawyers. What that means is before someone can lose their liberty, go to jail, or lose their money in a money judgment that is property, you get a hearing, you get a trial. And for accused men, women, whomever, they're going to get a process in this country because we actually do have a functioning judicial system. So that's part of the answer there. And then the issue is, well, women maybe won't or people won't feel a need to use online to air their grievances if the system is more fair. Which comes first, Rachel? Do we need the laws to change so that then social norms change, or do we need to raise our boys and girls differently so that they then grow up to change the laws? How do you see this? How do you see this optimally unfolding? I know all of it has to happen, but strategically, what's the optimal process here?
I think these elements really go hand in hand. We need to ensure that we're debating and discussing these issues in legislatures to ensure that women also have a fair hearing. But we also need to start right now with educating this rising generation to understand what consent means, what consent looks like. And so when we call for a recalibration of social norms, we specifically mention the importance of comprehensive sexuality education and in particular consent education. So we really can't do one without the other. The law in some senses is a reflection of social norms. So we need to be able to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time.
So we had a question in the chat that followed up on my comment that we have a functioning judicial system. The comment is, since when? What I was referring to is the fact that judges generally aren't bribed or paid, or police officers, in order to get any semblance of justice. Really a very different metric than in other parts of the country or of the world. Their judges do pay attention to facts and law. They get things wrong, and they're corrupt people. But do you think, in response to that question, do you think in the United States, as compared to other parts of the world, the judicial system is functioning properly when it comes to women's rights?
I think what this book shows us is that we have work to do on these issues everywhere in the world. And people in the United States, those at the forefront of this movement and those who are just observing, have something to learn from the fight that other leaders have waged. I take the case of Cece Balin. She brought her accusation to law enforcement. There were many other women who had had that similar experience that she had had. What recourse do those women have? Where is their due process? How can they obtain justice? I think we cannot answer one question without answering the other.
So policy change. What's your top three in order? In order. I'm going to push you because we can do this as a lawyer. We do this to each other. What's your number one, number two, number three? I mean, I know all of it in your dreamscape. They all happen. But what are they? Equal pay, an equal rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution. If you're, king or queen or monarch for a day and could do this, that's very hard to do, of course. But having thought about this, what is your ranked top three priorities as a matter of policy change, legal change, to affect more equality for women in the United States in particular?
Well, we looked at this in the US, but we looked at it globally as well. And so, the starting point is ensuring that there are adequate legal protections in place against harassment and assault, that judicial procedures are fair, and in other parts of the world in particular, ensuring that there's a level legal playing field for women. 3 years into this global MeToo movement, an astounding 50 countries still lack legal prohibitions on sexual harassment in the workplace. We have to change that. We have to change that overseas, and through our foreign policy, we need to elevate that issue on the agenda. So legal reform is a really important piece of the puzzle. Representation is another top priority. You know, many of the activists we talk to at the forefront of the movement are demanding a seat at decision-making tables as part of the solution. You know, gender parity and representation is a precondition to fixing the underlying power imbalances that have allowed leaders to turn a blind eye to sexual harassment and abuse for centuries. So, you know, we've seen really inspiring transitions of these campaigns, from campaigns against sexual abuse into campaigns for political power. I think we saw that even in our own country with the elections that we talked about earlier. And so that's another really important piece to resolve this. And then the last I will talk about is resources. You know, it's not enough to pay lip service to these issues. We need to ensure that we're adequately resourcing them. There's a backlog in testing of rape kits that's inexcusable in our country. And that's the type of lack of investment that suggests we're just not prioritizing these issues enough. And that certainly is something we see in other countries around the world. So we need to make sure that we're putting our money where our mouths are.
So that's fascinating. So there are women who experience rape, who go to the hospital, and there is not a rape kit that available to memorialize evidence relating to that crime. The rape kit is a medical sort of series of procedures that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that are utilized so that later law enforcement and prosecutors and courts and juries have a record, a physical record of what that woman experienced from a medical standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. You're saying, Rachel, that in the United States, women go to the hospital, it's not there, so they can't actually put together the file that's necessary to prosecute potentially her assailant?
What I'm saying is that in many places, there's a backlog of untested rape kits that are just languishing. And so if we, from a prosecutorial, from a criminal justice perspective, if we want women to come forward and go through the criminal justice system, then we need to ensure we're investing in the evidence collection that we're gathering and making sure that we're testing those untested rape kits that are sitting without anyone taking action, to make sure that if there are predators out there, that we're getting them off the streets.
That's incredible. So how long is this backlog, and who tests these things? It's the federal government, sort of, we just went through testing with COVID. I mean, do you have any insight into step by step how that works? I think that's really, really quite astonishing to me.
This is really a state issue. Criminal justice, as you well know, largely happens at the state level for crimes like this. But it's fascinating to see how this is an issue that's truly global. It's a problem here in the US, and it's a problem in other countries around the world. Just this past weekend, there was a front page story in the New York Times about sexual abuse that women in Egypt endure while rape kits are collected. There's a lot of work that we still have to do, but resources and investing in law enforcement and prioritizing these issues within the criminal justice system, that's a key part of the solution.
So really interesting. I'm just ticking through my mind the things that you've talked about. One is educating young people across genders about what it means to consent, empowering, girls and young women to understand how to do that, educating boys and other genders. I mean, of course, there's a spectrum of genders, to understand what that is and so they have the tools. Number two is changes to the law, you mentioned, to ban certain behaviors. In other countries, there aren't bans on sexual harassment. If anyone watches the series Mad Men from the 1960s about ad agencies in the United States, it wasn't that long ago that blatant sexual harassment in the workplace in the United States was legal. Do you think, Rachel, we need changes to our laws there?
Certainly. If we think about the challenges that women have had in obtaining justice, there are plenty of questions that one could raise about why it is in the first instance, even in a case like Bill Cosby, that the plea deal was struck because the thought was that a conviction couldn't be won. I think we need to look at outcomes here. If we have a scenario, a system in which women simply cannot obtain justice, regardless of how many women come forward, that is not a system that's fair. So due process is critical. That's the cornerstone, as I said, of any criminal justice system. But we need to ensure that we're restructuring the law in a way that women can obtain justice and prevail. And part of that is also about changing social norms, as we've talked about.
So one of our viewers offers that 6,000 kits are untested in the state of Maryland alone, and that police often lose kits. And when it comes to Bill Cosby, my understanding of the reporting is that they just thought she had waited too long, and that it was a credibility issue, that she wouldn't be believable. And the allegations are quite shocking. During the deposition testimony that happened after the original prosecutor decided not to prosecute, made a press release, Mr. Cosby admitted that he has historically drugged women with Quaaludes prior to sexual interactions. So we have, on the one hand, a man who, and I think there were some admissions made to the police even prior to the public announcement that there wasn't going to be any prosecution. We have Mr. Cosby, who by reports was not that sort of shy to give incriminating information, and his lawyers allowed it even without a written immunity deal. And on the other hand, well, there's some holes in her story. So maybe what we're talking about, Rachel, is changes to the rules of evidence. Is that where you are?
In some places, women have organized to change statutes of limitation to ensure that women have more time to come forward. And there are many reasons why a woman might not come forward immediately. In other cases, really a legal change may not be needed as much as our social understanding of the credibility of someone who comes forward with accusations needs to change. And in some cases is changing. When it comes to an issue like sexual harassment, there have been many bills introduced to eliminate the use of mandatory non-disclosure agreements, which then prevent women from coming forward and from coming forward together. So I think it's really a mixture of, in some cases, policy reform, and in other instances, shifting social norms.
Yeah, I was really struck. I was raised Catholic, and I was struck by, I think it was New York State or maybe it was the city of New York, changing the statute of limitations for boys, primarily boys who had been altar boys in the Catholic Church, to enable them to bring claims later than originally thought. And I don't know about you, but I haven't heard a whole lot of discussion around how those young people are probably lying in the way that we hear over and over and over again, that girls and young women who experience sexual assault are somehow making it up or somehow malingering one way or the other. And that really struck me, because that kind of reform is significant, is pretty important. Now, I want to ask, just as anecdotally, you've spoken to so many people, and of course, you've worked with a Nobel Prize laureate, Malala Yousafzai. Can you give us some stories, the stuff that stuck out for you? Like, wow, this woman is amazing. This is something I'll carry with you. What one or two really is going to stay with you, Rachel?
Well, I think immediately of the women that I had the privilege to meet in China, who were facing not only this scourge of sexual harassment and discrimination, but also censorship, which inhibits their ability to organize. And the women that I met were not only courageous, they were also creative. So they used 21st century technology to help circumvent censorship. They used blockchain technology to ensure that posts couldn't be taken down or could be immediately reposted once they were. They got around text-based censorship by resorting to imagery and emojis, actually texting an emoji of a rice bowl, which is pronounced me, and a bunny, which is pronounced too. And by doing that, they were able to essentially overwhelm the censors. And, there are some scholars who believe that the Me Too movement in China posed the biggest challenge to the government there, to Beijing, in decades, because there are a lot of women, and they were organizing collectively. They were raising their voices, and quite frankly, there were periods where the censors just couldn't keep up. So that, to me, is an incredibly hopeful story of what happens when women come together and express their collective power.
Well, the book is Awakening. I want to congratulate you, Rachel, on this tremendous accomplishment. It sounds like it's something we all need to read. And thank you so much for being on Simple Politics. Absolutely fascinating discussion. I should say we've had a discussion with a China expert, so Bonnie Glazer. So people can look at that on YouTube and learn a little more about China. But thank you so much, Rachel, for making the time to talk with us, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks for having me.
Good night, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for Simple Politics.